Hi, everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of Inside the Mind of a Hacker. And guess what we're going to be talking about today? Our good old friend, Nmap. Guys, welcome to this course that we're going to be in here together talking about penetration testing with Kali Linux. And I'm so excited to be talking about one of my favorite tools inside Kali, and that's Nmap, right? Nmap is basically short for network mapper. So what we're going to do today is a couple of things. So as you can see here, I've created this little diagram that we're going to be covering together, and what you're going to get out of the next maybe half an hour, 40 minutes that we're going to be spending together. So the very first area that we're going to look at is exactly what Nmap does, how it does it, and just basically a brief introduction around, what is Nmap, right? From there, we're going to look at some traditional TCP behaviors. So I thought, it's taken me a long while when I was into the field of penetration testing and doing red team engagements to actually learn and understand things from a practical sense, right? So you can read things, but when you're in the field, things operate very differently. So one is, I guess, a sort of a non-negotiable in this is the theory-based component, which we're then going to tie into the practical coming up. So I thought an area that we need to focus on very heavily is just a brief overview around TCP, UDP, the traditional behavior of how, for example, the three-way handshake that we're going to look at and how that works, and then how we can also abuse certain protocols and parameters within, the networks that we're going to be attacking, and host identification and so on. So up until this point, it's basically going to be a bit of a theory-based. And then from there on, after we talk about getting started, we're going to jump into the command line interface. And then it's going to be all practical sense from there on. So getting started, we're going to jump into Nmap. We're going to fire up Linux. We're going to fire up Nmap. And then we're going to start port scanning some awesome hosts that I've set up here on my own network. You guys can follow along as well. Just be mindful that if you are doing this in another environment, make sure that you do have explicit permissions, and I don't condone anyone just firing up Nmap and just start port scanning a host that you don't know or don't have authorization to scan. That's going to be illegal, and I don't condone any of that either. So from here, we're going to talk about getting started with Nmap. How do we port scan? We'll look at that, and then we're going to jump into the NSE, the scripting engine. And the scripting engine is basically a bunch of scripts that have been put together from some very amazing communities and people out there who we can then leverage to our own benefit. Obviously, add to those scripts in our own way when we're coming up with certain hosts and what that's going to look like as well. So these are all pre-created, scripting scripts that have been created that we can leverage. So if we're coming up against a certain host that we know it's probably susceptible to eternal blue, for example, we can use a scripting engine, using nmap --script equals vuln or whatever the case is, and then we can allow nmap to use those certain scripts that have been formulated for that specific vulnerability or host to then go and try and leverage those vulnerabilities and then hopefully be able to exploit it from there on. So we're going to take a look at the NSC, what that is. And from there, we're going to jump into the big brother, which is Nmap. And Nmap is the GUI interface of Nmap. So we're going to take a look at what that looks like and how that works and the difference between the two. And I thought an excellent addition to this would also be some real world parameters that we can then look at when we're taking this from a real world perspective as well. So some things that I've thought, coming into this from the real world, I want to give you guys the full practicality of, when you're coming up against a host that you don't know and you're in an unknown territory, how do you effectively attack it? And we'll look at some things there as well. So this is going to be about 40 minutes to maybe, between half an hour and 40 minutes. With about 10 minutes or so in theory. The rest is all going to be practical through the command line. Okay, so I want this to be very engaging. I want us to have fun, and I want us to sort of think outside the box and learn something new today. So let's get started, and let's just talk a little bit about Nmap for the next maybe 60 seconds or so. So in a nutshell, Nmap is just basically a really cool port scanner, right? And a port scanner, specifically Nmap, knows how to ask a question, right? So when you're doing a proper port scan, we ask a question to a certain host and we say, hey, can you tell me, for example, if this port is open or closed and how does it interact? Because a lot of devices on our network, some common protocols that we've seen are things like ICMP, echo response. So if I send a ping request out to a device, is that device going to then respond back with another ping? Things like ARP. If I send an ARP, a broadcast ARP request out to a bunch of hosts, how then, what's the return traffic going to look like to me if a host gets identified through an ARP request, and some more, right? So they're the only two I can think of off the top of my head right now. But in a nutshell, Nmap is there just to map and identify certain systems that we potentially might not know. So let's take this into account. Let's just say that our boss walks up to us and he says to us, Andrew, what devices do we have on our network, right? And as a good security engineer, I would say we have XYZ. These are the services, these are the ports open. But in many cases, a lot of the engineers don't know what they have open, right? They don't know what's in their environment. And Nmap is a very cool tool to very quickly identify certain hosts, their operating systems, the versions. So you can get very specific into identifying and potentially enumerating certain hosts, right? And that's what it does, right? That's the benefit of Nmap. And it's a really cool tool. And think of it like a scalpel. It's very precise and it's very accurate at most times. So a couple of measures as well that I want to talk about very quickly is a couple of things. If you're going into an engagement, it's probably a good measure that you do not fire up Nmap and just start port scanning the entire network. So if you're coming on into this engagement over here and you've got this host on a slash 24, which will have how many hosts in a slash 24 network? And if I hear you say, Andrew, there are 256 hosts on the network with 254 usable, I'll say you're absolutely correct. There are 254 hosts that are physically available on a slash 24 network. Now, if you come onto a slash 24 network and you start spraying Nmap to attack this network and start sending all these ping requests out to these hosts and seeing what's alive and what's not alive, chances are you're going to get caught very, very quickly, right? There might be some IPS or IDS in place. The firewall might pick you up and then we'll start restricting those IP addresses because you're going to be sending in the traffic from yourself. So your source IP address that's coming from you will get potentially blacklisted, right? And being an attacker, you can get another IP address and start filtering and start attacking the system again. But that's not the point. The point is, as a good practical measure, when you're coming up against a host in a network that you do not know, and you don't know what's on the other side of that, using Nmap in this scenario is probably not a good thing to do. You might want to do other parameters, which we are going to cover, things like doing banner grabs or doing proper other port identification mechanisms that we're going to talk about, but not in this specific Nmap series. You do not want to just open up Nmap and go for a ping and then just go, hey guys, what's available and what's not available? Because chances are, it could work, but you also do not want to do that. So when we look at ICMP, in most cases, a lot of devices, such example as a firewall, if I'm coming up against the firewall, it's not going to, a lot of the firewalls, I should say, will not respond to ICMP traffic, right? It just doesn't work like that. But a lot of the devices on a network will respond to ARP. So if I can send an Nmap request, looking like an ARP packet, that gets broadcasted onto the network, and then it says, hey, who is this guy, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 100, for example. The device with that IP address, all the devices will get flooded with that broadcast address. The device with that identification will then respond back to that host saying, hey, it's me, right? And then bang, we've got them. So then we can start doing other attacks and start leveraging layer 2, man-in-the-middle attacks or ARP spoofing attacks. And there's so many different parameters with Nmap that we're all going to cover, as we get into this series, once we start looking at the practical side and the command line. Things like decoys and using other IP addresses to mask our own source IP address. We can really leverage those cool things as well. Okay, so that's pretty much Nmap in a nutshell. It's just there to identify and validate systems for us, the operating systems, the versions, the host, what ports are open, what's closed, what's filtered. And it does that very, very well. Okay. So now we've talked a little bit about Nmap. Now let's just go over some traditional TCP behavior mechanisms and what they look like. So over here, I've got a client-server relationship, very common in many networks. To my left, I have Timmy, the client, and to my right, I have Jimmy, the server. Right now, don't take this literal. These are just naming conventions that I came up with that are just here to help us and make things very easy. As you can see, this is a traditional three-way handshake that we have that's now going to get established in this very scenario. Now, as you can see down here, we're talking about port 23, and I haven't mentioned what that is just yet. So if you're learning about networking or you're already established in networking, port 23 is the well-known port for Telnet. Okay, and as an attacker, we love to sniff out Telnet because it is plain text, right? It's not encrypted. And I can tell you in many environments that I've been in, I might put in a sniffer of it in the network, and surely enough, a dev team or a network infrastructure team or a help desk team, somehow I start seeing usernames and passwords come from Telnet. So as a good measure, you probably do not want to be using Telnet in your environment, and you might want to switch over to SSH, which is on port 22, right? So using secure shell, encrypted protocols to do file transfers or to log into other systems to then administer or manage those systems. So in this example, we use Telnet as the base example. And this is just a traditional three-way handshake between a client-server relationship as we're now initiating a three-way handshake with a server, okay? So firstly, the first request that goes out from Timmy to Jimmy is gonna look something like this. It's gonna basically say, hey there, Jimmy, I'd love to talk with you on port 23. Are you there? So all this is asking is port 23 open? And if you are, would you be able to talk to me, right? So when we think about TCP is very, very connection oriented, right? It's very aggressive in the way it communicates, and it needs and wants to verify exchange. So the communication between devices, it has to verify with certain parameters such as an acknowledgement, a SYN request, and an acknowledgement in most cases. When we look at UDP, it's it's almost the opposite of that. It doesn't acknowledge, it's connectionless, and it pretty much sounds like it just doesn't care in a way, right? So TCP is very different. Just think of TCP and UDP being those two different areas where TCP is just highly, highly aggressive in the way it communicates. So the very first packet that gets sent from Timmy to Jimmy is going to look something like that. It's going to say, hey, I'm sending a SYN request saying, hey, I'd love to connect with you on port 23. Are you there? And are you open, essentially? And I will be sending him my very own sequence number. Now, these sequence numbers are not, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There could be 410, could be 201, could be 104. It doesn't matter. This is just a simple explanation for this diagram, right? And then I'll be sending him my sequence number over to Jimmy the server. So Jimmy the server, being a good Telnet server, listening on that port, he will then say, hey, I do have port 23 open. If you want to connect to me, you can absolutely connect to me. So what Jimmy then does is he sends another packet back out to Timmy saying, hey, I acknowledged your SYN request, right? And that's what the SYN is here, saying, hey, I have acknowledged that request, and now I will be sending you my own sequence number along with your acknowledgement of what you've acknowledged the sequence number. In this case, it was 10, just over here. So with a +1, that just verifies that it's received our acknowledgement of our SYN request going to him of 10. So 10 + 1 is 11. That's just a way that it'll verify that, yes, I received your request. Now to validate that request, I've now added the one parameter of what I'm expecting back from you. So that's basically it. So it's going to send us that back to us. And then Timmy, being the good client, he can now verify that three-way handshake and then sending obviously the acknowledgement back with an acknowledgement number of 51, which is over here. which is validating the sequence number back from Jimmy, which is 1 greater than 50, right? So it's a +1 like relationship. You send me a number, I +1 to that. That's just to me verify that, hey, you are listening to what I'm asking you, and now we have an exchange. And then obviously our sequence number here of 11, 1 greater than 10 of what we sent initially. Okay, so if you can see that here, the sequence number of 11, it's saying I'm expecting 11 to come back to me if you do want to connect with me. So that's the traditional three-way handshake explained. That's how, in most cases, devices connect. Obviously, you have the SYN-ACK that comes back and forth, and they exchange their own sequence numbers and acknowledgement numbers, like we've just seen. And the same is very much the same when we talk about the session termination as well. So when a session terminates between a client server and I no longer need the data from that server, it goes into the same like scenario. We send a fin signal in our TCP header that's saying, hey, I'm finished with all my transfers. I don't need to send you any more information, with a sequence number to validate that. Now the server is then going to send 2 parameters back to us when we're thinking of, let's say in this example, of telnet. And this is in most cases anything that's using TCP for that matter. So the request comes back. So there's going to be 2 packets that are going to come back from the server saying, hey, I've received your request to end our relationship. I've got all the data. So it's going to send our acknowledgement saying, hey, I've acknowledged you that you want to finish our request. The sequence number is going to be a +1 to what we've sent, right? So the acknowledgement of 1. And then I'll also send the sequence number of my own sync, my own sequence number. In this case, it's 100. And, I've got all the data you need, and that's it. So I'm going to set the finish along with that sequence number of 101, right? So 2 packets are going to go out, 100, 101, and an acknowledgement. Us being on the other end of that, we're going to say, cool, I've got no other data to send you. I acknowledge that. I've acknowledged the 102 request. So 101, 100, 101, 102 is the next number that comes back, plus our own sequence number of what we specified up here as our initial sync request that went out. So, and that's it. And that's how the TCP will basically finalize the handshake. And once we terminate the session, that's the right session termination, essentially. So for us to understand that, we can now start abusing certain parameters within TCP headers, because once we start knocking on systems, we don't have to start using the traditional TCP behaviors. We don't have to start sending SYN requests, right? We can start sending other parameters within the TCP header and seeing how devices will then handle those requests, right? So let's take a look at this example. So, me being an attacker over here on this network with this port open, trying to attack this server, the first parameter I can do is send out a SYN request on port 80, and port 80 is the well-known port for HTTP, right? And I can say, hey, Mr. Server, are you open on port 80? And the server will say, hey, I am. And if you want to connect with me, here's my SYN request, here's my sequence number, here's your acknowledgement. Now, as an attacker, we can do 2 things once this happens. We can acknowledge that, which will do what? If we acknowledge that request that comes back, we've essentially formed a 3-way handshake, but we don't want to do that, right? As an attacker, we want to now start knocking on systems and saying, hey, is port 80 open? Is port 22 open? Is port 23 open? So we want to start knocking on systems and identifying what those systems are. So very, very quickly, what Nmap can do is it can send a reset flag back to that host and say, thanks, but no thanks. Now, we haven't formed a session with that host, and that's okay because we don't want to form a 3-way handshake with that host. We just want to validate that it's running on port 80, potentially, and it's willing to accept a session with us, right? So we can send a reset back to that host, say, cool, no thanks. And very quickly, we don't have to take a lot of bandwidth doing that. So, when you're sending in all these packets into the network, it just does it very swiftly, and we don't need to worry about, taking up and saturating the links on the network. So very quickly, we can identify if port 80 is open or not, and then that will validate that the port is open in this case. A closed port in this example, if I send a TCP SYN request on port 80 to this server, and I get a reset back, it's very, very likely that the port is closed. Okay, and it doesn't want to connect, and it doesn't want to, you know, form a session with us. It's just telling us that that session is closed, and obviously that port is closed, so there's nothing else on there. So once we start abusing things, we can start leveraging certain parameters within TCP in this example. So we can send a FIN signal, a FIN flag in the TCP header. We can send an urgent flag. We can send push, null. And this is known as a Christmas tree scan in most cases, because when you fire up Wireshark and you look at the TCP information, which we will do in the demo, you'll see that it looks like a Christmas tree the way it flags, and that's the way it looks, right? Because all these flags are set, and it looks like a Christmas tree, just like that. And taking into consideration the other end of the Christmas tree. So in this example, if we do send a Christmas tree scan, so if we go Nmap, TAC SX, and the host, in this example, and if we don't have any reply coming back from that host, it's a strong indicator that the port is probably open, and obviously takes more further enumeration to validate what's on that port. But a good example is to now know that, hey, that port on port 80, in that case, is potentially open and available for us. So having said that, we can start leveraging certain parameters within TCP to try and exploit this host. So for example, another example could be, I can send a straight acknowledgement to that host, right? If you remember, an acknowledgement usually comes between the second and third reply packets, or the acknowledgement packet that comes back from our end. So as an attacker, what happens now, if we can just send a straight acknowledgement to that host, we want to see how that host then responds to that packet if it doesn't receive it, and if it does receive it, how it handles that interaction. So we need to think different, and we need to think in terms of what else can I now do and try and throw this system off when the way it responds back to us with information. Okay, and let's now take a look at the closed port of what that's going to look like. So in this example, if we probe the packet with a SYN request, with obviously all these flags set in the Christmas tree scan, and we get a reset or an acknowledgement that comes back to us from that host, it's a good solid indication that that port is either filtered or closed. Now, filtered does not mean closed. Closed means closed, but filtered does not mean closed. It could be filtered or it could be closed. And filtered just means that it's probably going through an access control list, or it's probably got some filtering on that device. That's meaning that it's probably going to have to get authentication before you can authorize requests over that host. So that's the open closed port scenario of using different header information and start leveraging TCP header information to start port scanning aggressively for hosts. All right, and that's pretty much it for our session here on the theory base. So that's Nmap in a nutshell. TCP behaviors that we just mentioned. Now we're going to move over into the practical sense, where we start leveraging the awesome tool of Nmap. I'll see you guys very soon.